The joke left my mouth like a careless, fragile spark, but the heavy, suffocating silence that followed burned straight through the marrow of our quiet apartment. One fleeting moment I was leaning against the hallway wall, laughing nervously, asking my roommate if she would just marry me to escape yet another suffocating, family-arranged setup. The next, Soraya Hale was standing in her doorway, her fingers wrapping around my hand with an intensity that startled me, leading me toward her bedroom without uttering a single word. My name is Callum Rains. Before that specific afternoon, I honestly believed I understood the anatomy of silence. I thought silence was the agonizingly empty chair sitting across from me at the breakfast table after my mother passed away, leaving the world a fraction colder. I thought silence was the mounting pile of unread, unanswered messages from my father, who had remarried and relocated 2 states away, navigating his life as if grief were merely a room he could walk out of and lock behind him. I thought silence was the predictable routine of coming home from work every evening to a pristine, sterile apartment where my roommate and I coexisted like polite, well-meaning strangers, sharing the rent, dividing the dishes, and exchanging superficial weather reports, while carefully guarding the heavier, fractured parts of our lives. But that day, as Soraya's fingers tightened around mine, and she pulled me gently yet unyieldingly toward her open bedroom door, I learned that silence could be a torrential downpour. I learned it could be louder than the most agonizing confession, louder than desperate crying, louder than any yes or no a human being could ever summon the courage to speak. We had been roommates for 8 months, an arrangement born mostly out of sheer accident and financial convenience. I worked as a project estimator for a commercial construction firm, the kind of rigid, clinical occupation where I spent my days measuring other people's grand architectural dreams in square feet, materials, and bottom-line costs, all while quietly, methodically avoiding the blueprints of my own life. Soraya, on the other hand, worked from home as a freelance textile designer. She possessed a rare, breathtaking talent for turning blank, lifeless fabrics into intricate patterns pulsing with vibrant color, even as she wore an invisible, crushing sadness that she never once attempted to explain. She moved through our shared spaces with a careful, deliberate grace, maintaining a quiet distance that made most people mistakenly assume she was proud or aloof. But I had witnessed enough small, unguarded moments to know much better. I had seen her quietly leave warm containers of food outside our elderly neighbor's door in the dead of winter, retreating before she could ever be thanked or take credit. I had seen her sit motionless by the window on gray, rainy afternoons, her hands wrapped around a porcelain mug long after the tea inside had gone completely cold and lifeless. I had heard her laugh genuinely just once during a rare phone call, only to fall into an immediate, breathless silence the moment the caller uttered a specific man's name. Soraya was not cold. She was simply a fortress, heavily guarded. That particular afternoon was exceptionally bright, almost mockingly so, given the profound heaviness that was waiting for us inside. Brilliant autumn sunlight spilled recklessly across the apartment floor, turning our mundane hallway into a corridor of pooled, liquid gold. I had returned home early because a major site inspection had been abruptly canceled, and I found Soraya standing in the kitchen. She was dressed in fluid, cream lounge pants and a rich burgundy satin camisole, her dark hair falling loosely over one shoulder as if she had started getting ready for the world outside and then suddenly lost the vital strength to continue. She was staring intently at her phone resting on the marble counter. She wasn't reading it. She wasn't touching it. She was just staring at the dark screen as if it had delivered a piece of news that completely rearranged the geography of her entire life. I tried my best not to pry. That was the foundational rule between us, the unspoken, comfortable agreement that kept our domestic arrangement functional. But she looked so impossibly far away, so utterly stranded in her own mind, that I made the classic mistake I always made when I didn't know how to navigate someone else's pain. I cracked a joke. I picked up an apple from the ceramic bowl, leaned casually against the counter, and told her that if her phone was just another intrusive family member trying to force her into an arranged marriage, she should probably just marry me instead and scare them all into absolute permanent silence. I fully expected a standard eye roll, maybe a tired, polite smile, perhaps one of her signature, dryly witty replies. Instead, she looked up and locked her eyes onto mine as if I had accidentally stumbled upon and thrown open a heavy door she had spent years breaking her back to hold shut. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of us breathed. Neither of us moved. Then, she took a slow step closer, reached out, and took my hand in hers. She walked past me, pulling me out of the kitchen and into the hallway. I asked her what she was doing, but the words caught in my throat, and my voice came out much smaller, much more fragile than I expected. She didn't answer. She only tightened her grip, her palm warm against mine, and kept walking directly toward her bedroom. I followed her without resistance, because something raw and deeply wounded in her expression completely stopped me from pulling away. She wasn't playing a game. She wasn't flirting. Her eyes were wide, nervous, profoundly hurt, and yet fiercely determined, resembling a person walking open-eyed toward a devastating truth because the act of running had finally become more painful than facing it. Her bedroom was immaculately neat, noticeably warmer than the rest of the drafty apartment, filled with pale, soft bedding and a small bedside lamp that cast a gentle amber glow even in the midst of the daylight. A framed landscape painting hung quietly above the headboard. On the center of the bed sat a polished wooden box I had never seen before in all our months of living together. Beside it lay a heavy cream envelope, its edge opened with meticulous care. Soraya let go of my hand only when we reached the edge of the mattress. For a long moment, she stood with her back turned to me, her shoulders rising and falling as she focused on breathing slowly, deeply. Then, with a trembling hand, she lifted the wooden lid. Inside lay the fragments of a shattered life. Old photographs, faded hospital bracelets, a neatly folded, pastel baby blanket, and a simple silver ring set with a small, brilliant blue stone. My stomach tightened with a sickening, intuitive dread before my brain could even process what I was looking at. She picked up one of the photographs and held it out to me, her fingers shaking slightly. In it, she looked significantly younger, laughing effortlessly beside a tall man wearing a faded denim jacket. Her smile in that picture was entirely open, radiant, and completely fearless. Nothing like the guarded, careful half-smiles I had grown accustomed to. I looked down at the photograph, then back up to her pale face, and she finally spoke. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of an anchor. She told me his name was Varen. She told me he had been her fiancé. And then, she told me he had died 2 years ago in a violent car accident, on the exact morning they were scheduled to sign the lease for their very first apartment together. The bedroom suddenly seemed to lose all its oxygen. I stood there holding the glossy photograph, a wave of intense shame washing over me. Ashamed of my thoughtless joke, ashamed of my casual demeanor, ashamed of every easy, superficial sentence I had ever deployed in my life to cover up the gaping wounds of another person's tragedy. Soraya sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, looking down at her lap, and explained that after Varen passed, her family simply didn't know what to do with the sheer magnitude of her grief. So, like many well-meaning families, they tried to solve it. They introduced her to eligible men. They arranged formal dinners. They constantly reminded her that she was still so young, telling her that love could easily come again, speaking of affection as if it were merely a torn window curtain that could be unhooked and casually replaced with a newer fabric. That very morning, her aunt had sent over another formal proposal. A wealthy widower, a respectable man from a good background, a thoroughly practical match. Her family was demanding a definitive answer by the evening. Then, she looked up at me, tears pooling in her eyes, shining brilliantly but refusing to fall, and told me that my joke had cut her deeply. It hurt because it sounded exactly like every other careless, superficial thing people had thrown at her since the funeral. But it also hurt because, for one fleeting, impossible, terrifying second, she wished with all her heart that I had actually meant it. Not because she had fallen in love with me in the sudden, theatrical way people pretend love happens in books, she explained, but because, over the last 8 months, I had somehow become the only person in her entire life who allowed her to simply exist in her brokenness without constantly demanding that she heal on a pre-approved schedule. I took a slow breath and sat down on the bed beside her, making sure to leave a respectful, intentional space between our bodies, and apologized. I didn't do it quickly, and I didn't do it defensively. I looked her in the eyes and told her how deeply sorry I was for making light of a sacred, heavy shadow that I had no right to touch, let alone understand. She shook her head softly, a sad smile touching her lips, and confessed that the worst part of it all was that she had been quietly angry with me for months. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because my presence made ordinary, mundane life feel safe again. I made the morning coffee entirely too strong. I quietly fixed the loose cabinet handle in the kitchen without ever mentioning it or asking for praise. I instinctively left the last slice of mango for her in the fridge because I had silently noticed it was her favorite. I never asked her why she had been crying her eyes out in the laundry room last winter. I had just left her be, giving her room to breathe. I had never pushed her, never chased her, never tried to play the role of the grand hero rescuing a damsel. And somehow, she whispered, that quiet, steady respect had been infinitely harder to resist than all the grand, sweeping promises other people had ever made to her. I sat there, completely struck dumb, not knowing what to say. In the narrative of my own life, I had become an absolute expert at making myself useful without ever allowing myself to be truly known. I could repair a broken hinge, I could carry heavy groceries up the stairs, I could pay my portion of the bills exactly on time, and I could always make people laugh the moment a conversation grew too honest or vulnerable. But sitting beside Soraya in the quiet sanctity of that bedroom, I realized with a jolt that she had seen right through my armor, too. She quietly asked me why I never brought anyone home. She asked why I never spoke about my childhood or my family. She asked why I kept my mother's old, faded winter scarf tucked away on the top shelf of the hall closet like a hidden, unhealed wound. My first instinct was to lie, to deflect with another joke. But then I looked at the open wooden box resting on her bed, at the remnants of her heart laid bare, and I understood that absolute truth was the only respectful, dignified gift I had left to offer her. So, I told her about my mother. I told her how she used to sing old, soulful songs at the top of her lungs while cooking dinner, how the illness had taken her piece by piece, agonizingly slowly, and how I had forced myself to move through the world afterward pretending I was perfectly fine, because I quickly learned that people become intensely uncomfortable when someone's grief stays around for too long. I told her how my father had essentially vanished into the clean slate of a new marriage because he couldn't bear the heavy ghost of his old life. And finally, I confessed to her that I hadn't asked a single person to stay in my life for years, because I was absolutely terrified that they might actually say yes, only to turn around and leave me behind anyway. Soraya listened to every word without a single interruption, her gaze steady and profoundly empathetic. For the very first time since we had signed our lease, the silence between us did not feel like a vast, unbridgeable distance. It felt like a bridge being meticulously, carefully constructed in real time, plank by plank, anchor by anchor. Outside the window, the mundane world kept moving on. Cars passed by on the asphalt below. Someone laughed light-heartedly in the building's central courtyard. The afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the hardwood floor, eventually reaching the edge of the bed, illuminating the wooden box, and resting over our hands, which were sitting just inches apart on the fabric. Eventually, Soraya picked up her phone from the bed, dialed her aunt, and put it to her ear. Her voice trembled noticeably on the first few words, but she did not break down. She stated clearly that she would not be meeting the widower. She said, with a quiet, undeniable steel in her tone, that she was not a financial or emotional burden to be neatly transferred from one household to another. She said she was still grieving, she was still living, and she was still entirely allowed to decide for herself when her own heart was ready to open. I watched her utter those words, and a profound realization washed over me. She hadn't led me into her bedroom because she wanted a dramatic answer to a foolish hallway joke. She had led me there because she desperately needed a witness while she finally chose herself. The moment the call disconnected, she cried. She didn't cry loudly, and she didn't cry beautifully. Real, soul-cleansing crying is rarely beautiful. It violently bends the face, it shakes the shoulders to the core, and it forcefully empties years of bitter, swallowed pain. I didn't reach out to touch her at first. I simply stayed right there, anchored beside her. Then, she reached across the space and took my hand again, and I held it with everything I had. Not as a binding promise of marriage, not as a romantic beginning forced too soon, but as living, breathing proof that she was no longer alone in that room. That was the definitive day we truly became friends. Things didn't magically transform overnight. Real, lasting healing never moves with the swift grace of a movie montage, no matter how much a hurting person wishes it would. For weeks following that afternoon, Soraya still endured incredibly difficult mornings. Some days she barely uttered a word, retreating into the quiet sanctuary of her mind. Some days she would cook a massive dinner enough for both of us and leave my plate carefully covered on the counter before disappearing into her room. Some days I would walk into the living room and find her sitting silently in the dark with Varen's ring resting in the open palm of her hand. And over time, I learned exactly how not to rush her away from her memories. In return, she learned to read my silences, too. She entirely stopped asking me if I was okay in that superficial way that practically demanded a cheerful, reassuring answer. Instead, when she sensed the dark clouds rolling into my mind, she would simply sit nearby in the same room. She would fold laundry, sketch her intricate textile patterns, or just quietly exist beside me until the air in the room felt a little less heavy, a little less empty. Slowly, imperceptibly, our apartment transformed from a place where two people hid their scars into a sanctuary where broken things were explicitly allowed to be broken. I finally fixed the old, weathered balcony chair, and she responded by filling the entire balcony with vibrant, living green plants. She taught me how to feel a piece of fabric and tell the difference between material made to actually last and material merely designed to look expensive. I taught her how to properly patch and smooth out a damaged drywall. She began to laugh more often, a genuine, chiming sound, and every single time she did, I could feel something tightly knotted deep within my own chest begin to loosen. We still argued about stupid, petty things, of course. She absolutely hated how I carelessly left metal measuring tapes on almost every surface in the apartment. I hated how she continuously bought beautiful ceramic mugs when our kitchen cabinets were already overflowing. But even our arguments began to feel comforting, a vibrant, noisy proof of shared life. One crisp Saturday afternoon, several months after that transformative day in her bedroom, Soraya quietly asked me if I would drive her to visit Varen's grave. I drove the entire way in absolute silence, not because there was an awkward lack of things to say, but because some sacred journeys simply deserve the dignity of quiet. When we arrived, she brought a bouquet of fresh white flowers and a tightly folded, handwritten letter. I stepped back, standing several paces away under the shade of an old oak tree, giving her space while she spoke softly to the cold stone. She told the man she had loved so deeply that she was finally tired of merely surviving. Tired of living as though loyalty to his memory required her own life to remain permanently frozen in amber. When she finally walked back to the car, her eyes were red and swollen, but her shoulders looked lighter than I had ever seen them. On the drive home, as we paused at a red light, she slipped her slender hand into mine, and when the light turned green, she didn't let go. Love blossomed slowly after that, almost shyly, like a nocturnal flower opening to the moon. It didn't arrive with fireworks. It came in the quiet routine of morning coffee brewed exactly the way the other person preferred it. It came in the shared, mundane grocery lists and the accumulation of ridiculous inside jokes. It came on the nights when she fell fast asleep on the sofa during a movie, only to wake up hours later to find I had gently covered her with a warm blanket and turned off the television. It came on the terrifying afternoon when I had a severe panic attack after receiving a sudden email stating my father wanted to visit, and Soraya simply sat flat on the hardwood floor beside me, holding my wrists until the world stopped spinning and I could breathe again. It came in the quiet, terrifying realization that another human being had become absolutely necessary to your existence without either of us ever granting formal permission. The day she finally brought up my old hallway joke again, we happened to be standing in the exact same corridor where everything had originally begun. Warm afternoon light filled the apartment, casting long, familiar shadows. Her bedroom door stood wide open behind her, the very same door she had pulled me through months earlier. She was wearing a simple, fluid blue dress, her dark hair tied up loosely, her face softer and more radiant than I had ever witnessed it. She looked at me, a mischievous glint in her eyes, and asked whether I remembered what silly thing I had said to her right there on that spot. I looked back at her and told her I remembered every single microsecond of it. She smiled, a few sudden tears glistening in her eyes, and said that she didn't want to marry someone just to escape her overbearing family, or to run away from her deep grief, or to numb the sting of loneliness. She wanted, someday, to marry someone because peace had finally felt like a living, breathing person. Then, she locked her gaze onto mine and whispered that lately, peace had started looking a whole lot like me. I didn't propose to her that day. It would have been entirely too easy, too cheap, to turn a sacred, fragile moment into a dramatic, cinematic gesture. Instead, I simply took her in my arms and told her that I loved her, plainly, honestly, vulnerably, without attaching any conditions or asking for a single thing in return. Soraya cried again, but this time, her tears carried the sweet weight of hope instead of the bitter sting of loss. She whispered that she loved me too, but asked that we take it slowly, carefully, ensuring there was always enough room for both the heavy past and the bright future to stand together in the very same heart. And for us, that was more than enough. It was everything. A full year later, I did ask her to marry me, but this time, there wasn't a single trace of a joke. I asked her on our small balcony, completely surrounded by the lush green plants she had lovingly brought back to life, with the sun setting in a brilliant, fiery gold across the city skyline. I stood before her, my hands shaking, with my mother's old winter scarf tied gently around the velvet ring box. Soraya gasped and whispered yes, before the final words could even clear my throat. Then, she laughed through her tears, playfully reminding me that technically, I had already asked her first in the hallway a long time ago. I pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and told her that back then, I was just a coward hiding behind humor. This time, I was standing completely naked in the truth. Years later, when friends or strangers ask us how our love story truly began, Soraya never leads with the joke. She always looks across the room at me, her eyes softening, and says that it officially began the day too deeply grieving. Fiercely guarded people finally stopped pretending they were fine. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when we pass that specific hallway in our home, she will suddenly squeeze my hand a little tighter and glance toward the bedroom door with that exact same profound, quiet look from the afternoon that changed our destinies. And in those moments, I am instantly transported back. I remember vividly how she had led me there without a single word, not to ignite a sudden romance, not to answer a foolish proposal, but to bravely show me the heavy, locked room inside her heart. The true miracle was never that I stepped inside it. The miracle was that after everything she had brutally lost to the dark, she trusted me enough to leave the door wide open,